It was a quiet evening when Mrs. Thompson, an elderly woman, sat on her porch, enjoying the cool breeze. Suddenly, she heard hurried footsteps, small, fast, desperate. She turned her head just in time to see a little girl, no older than 6, running towards her. The child's dress was torn, her face streaked with dirt, and her eyes filled with fear. Mrs. Thompson stood up quickly. "Oh dear, what's wrong?" The girl stopped in front of her. "Here's the 800-word part 1 of your emotional story in third-person style, using simple English with suspense and a strong hook to keep the audience engaged. Part 1. A mysterious escape." Mrs. Thompson sat on her front porch, enjoying the quiet evening. The sun was setting, painting the sky in soft orange and pink. She rocked gently in her old wooden chair, sipping her tea. Her little cat, Whiskers, curled up at her feet, purring softly. Everything was peaceful. Until she heard it. Footsteps. Fast. Uneven. Small. Mrs. Thompson's heart skipped a beat. She turned her head towards the street. A little girl was running toward her house. She looked terrified. The child's blonde hair was messy, her dress torn at the edges. Her tiny legs moved as fast as they could, but she kept looking over her shoulder, as if someone was chasing her. Mrs. Thompson placed her tea down and stood up. Her old bones ached, but something inside her told her this was serious. The girl ran straight to her, panting, her chest rising and falling rapidly. When she reached the porch, she grabbed Mrs. Thompson's hand tightly. "Help me," the girl whispered, her voice shaking. Mrs. Thompson knelt down, her heart pounding. "What's wrong, dear? Are you lost?" The girl shook her head violently. "He's coming. Please, don't let him take me." A cold chill ran down Mrs. Thompson's spine. Who was coming? She looked around the street, but it was empty. The neighborhood was usually quiet, with friendly neighbors and kids playing in their yards. But now it felt different. Too quiet. Too still. Mrs. Thompson gently touched the girl's cheek. "It's okay, sweetheart. You're safe here. Just tell me, who's after you?" The girl hesitated, her small fingers tightening around Mrs. Thompson's hand. Her lips trembled as she whispered a name. "Mr. Harris." Mrs. Thompson frowned. That name sounded familiar, but before she could ask anything else, she heard something that made her blood turn cold. Footsteps, slow, heavy, getting closer. The girl gasped and squeezed her eyes shut. "He's here." Mrs. Thompson's eyes darted towards the street. A tall figure was walking toward them. A man. His steps were calm, too calm for someone who had just lost a child. He wore a dark jacket and had a stern face. When he saw Mrs. Thompson and the girl, he smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. "There you are, little one," he said, his voice smooth but firm. "You shouldn't run off like that. You scared me." The girl shook her head, stepping closer to Mrs. Thompson. "No, I don't want to go with you." Mrs. Thompson felt a lump in her throat. Something was wrong, very wrong. She looked at the man carefully. His clothes were clean, his voice was calm, but his eyes were cold. "Sir," she said, trying to stay calm. "Who are you?" The man's smile widened slightly. "I'm her uncle," he said smoothly. "She got lost while we were walking home. Thank you for keeping her safe, but I'll take her now." Mrs. Thompson felt the little girl trembling beside her. The child gripped her dress tightly, as if begging her not to let go. Something didn't feel right. Mrs. Thompson's instincts screamed at her. This wasn't just a scared child running to her porch. This was a child running for her life. She tightened her hold on the girl and took a deep breath. "If you're her uncle, then you won't mind if I call her parents, right?" For the first time, the man's face changed. The fake smile twitched slightly. "That's not necessary," he said quickly. "I can handle this." Mrs. Thompson's eyes narrowed. "I think it is necessary." The girl's grip tightened even more. Her tiny fingers were shaking. The man took a step forward, his eyes darkening. "Give me the child." Mrs. Thompson's heart pounded. She could feel whiskers hissing at her feet. The little girl was almost in tears now. Taking a deep breath, Mrs. Thompson did the only thing she could think of. She stepped backward, pulling the child inside her house. Then she slammed the door shut. Outside, the man stood still for a moment. Then he knocked hard. "Open the door," he demanded. Mrs. Thompson didn't move. Instead, she reached for the phone with trembling fingers. She dialed 911. The little girl clung to her side as Mrs. Thompson whispered into the phone. "There's a man outside my house." A little girl ran to me, terrified. "I think she's in danger." The operator responded quickly. "Stay inside, ma'am. Help is on the way." Mrs. Thompson exhaled, trying to calm herself. But outside, the knocking grew louder. Then it stopped. Silence. She peeked through the window. The man was gone. But somehow, Mrs. Thompson knew this wasn't over yet. Mrs. Thompson held the little girl close, her heart racing. Had the man really left? Or was he still out there, watching? She peered through the curtains, her breath shallow. The front porch was empty. The street was quiet. Too quiet. The little girl sniffled, wiping her tears with her tiny hands. "Is he gone?" she whispered. Mrs. Thompson hesitated. She wasn't sure. Something felt off. The man had knocked aggressively, demanded the girl, but then he vanished, just like that. She picked up the phone again, her hands still shaking. 911. "What's your emergency?" Mrs. Thompson took a deep breath. That man was just here. He wanted the girl, but now he's gone. "Please, send someone quickly." "Officers are on the way, ma'am." "Stay inside. Keep your doors locked." Mrs. Thompson locked the door immediately, checking it twice. Then she turned to the little girl, who was still trembling. "Sweetheart, can you tell me your name?" she asked gently. The girl hesitated, looking down at her small hands. Finally, she whispered, "Lily." Mrs. Thompson smiled kindly. "That's a beautiful name, Lily. Where are your parents?" Lily's eyes filled with tears again. She didn't answer. A horrible thought crossed Mrs. Thompson's mind. Did she even have parents, or had something happened to them? Before she could ask again, there was a loud thud outside. Mrs. Thompson jumped. Lily gasped and clung to her. It came from the backyard. Someone was there. Mrs. Thompson's breath hitched. The man. He hadn't left. He was trying to get in another way. Slowly, she grabbed a fireplace poker, her hands tightening around the cold metal. She had to protect Lily. The back door had a small window, covered with a thin curtain. Mrs. Thompson carefully pulled it aside just a little, and her stomach dropped. A dark figure stood just beyond the glass, barely visible in the dim porch light. The same man. He wasn't knocking this time. He was staring, waiting. Then he lifted one hand and placed it flat against the glass. Mrs. Thompson's breath caught in her throat. His fingers slowly curled into a fist. He was about to knock, or worse, and the police weren't here yet. Lily whimpered. Mrs. Thompson tightened her grip on the poker. "Stay behind me," she whispered. The man's fist finally knocked. One loud, deliberate bang. Mrs. Thompson braced herself. Then, sirens, loud and fast, cutting through the night. The man froze. For a second, he just stood there, as if deciding what to do. Then he ran. Mrs. Thompson yanked the door fully closed and locked it tight. She could hear footsteps pounding away, fading into the darkness. A moment later, flashing red and blue lights flooded the yard. The police had arrived. Lily clutched Mrs. Thompson's dress, tears falling silently. Mrs. Thompson knelt beside her, stroking her hair. "It's okay, sweetheart. You're safe now." But deep down, she knew this was just the beginning. The flashing police lights painted the walls of Mrs. Thompson's living room in streaks of red and blue. Lily sat on the couch, her small hands gripping a warm cup of tea that Mrs. Thompson had given her, but she wasn't drinking it. She was too shaken. Two police officers stood by the door, taking notes as Mrs. Thompson explained everything. The knocking, the man's strange behavior, the way Lily had begged her not to let him take her. Officer Martinez, a tall man with sharp eyes, knelt beside Lily and spoke in a gentle voice. "Sweetheart, can you tell us what happened? Why were you running?" Lily looked down, her little fingers tracing the rim of the cup. She hesitated. Mrs. Thompson could see it in her eyes. "Fear. It's okay, honey," she reassured her. "No one can hurt you here." Lily sniffled and took a shaky breath. Then, in a barely audible whisper, she spoke. "He's not my uncle." Mrs. Thompson felt her stomach drop. She knew it. The officers exchanged a glance. "Who is he, then?" Officer Martinez asked. Lily's hands tightened around the cup. I don't know. But he took me." "Took her?" Mrs. Thompson felt a chill run through her body. "Took you from where, sweetheart?" she asked softly. Lily swallowed hard, her voice breaking. "From the park. I was with my nanny. She went to get ice cream. And then he grabbed me." Mrs. Thompson gasped. The poor child had been kidnapped. Officer Martinez stood up quickly, his jaw tightening. This was serious. The second officer, a woman named Officer Davis, took out her radio. "Dispatch, we have a possible child abduction case. Checking for missing reports now." Mrs. Thompson's heart raced. What if Lily's parents were out there, searching for her? Just then, Officer Davis's radio crackled. "Confirmed missing child report. 6-year-old Lily Carter. Taken from Greenview Park 5 hours ago. Parents have been searching all night." Mrs. Thompson felt Lily flinch at the sound of her full name. Officer Martinez knelt back down, his voice firm but kind. "Lily, sweetheart, your parents are looking for you. We're going to take you home." Lily's eyes widened in panic. She shook her head violently. "No, I can't go back. He'll find me." Mrs. Thompson reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "Your parents will protect you, darling. And so will the police." Lily's lips trembled. "He said, if I tell anyone, he'll come for me." Mrs. Thompson's heart clenched. This man wasn't just a stranger. He was dangerous. Officer Martinez's expression darkened. "Not if we find him first." But deep inside, Mrs. Thompson had a terrible feeling. What if he wasn't finished yet? Lily clung to Mrs. Thompson's arm, her small body trembling. Even though the police had confirmed she was a missing child, she still looked terrified. She didn't feel safe. Officer Martinez knelt beside her again, trying to reassure her. "Lily, I promise we won't let him hurt you. We need to get you home." Lily's eyes darted toward the window, where the police car's flashing lights lit up the dark street. Her voice was barely a whisper. "What if he's watching?" Mrs. Thompson shuddered at the thought. What if the man hadn't run far? What if he was still out there, waiting? Just then, Officer Davis's radio crackled again. "Suspect spotted near Oakwood Street. Black hoodie, gray pants, running on foot." Lily gasped and buried her face in Mrs. Thompson's side. He was close. Officer Martinez's expression hardened. "That's less than 3 blocks from here." He stood up fast, speaking into his radio. "All units, we need backup. Do not let him get away." Officer Davis turned to Mrs. Thompson. "Keep the doors locked. We'll call you when it's safe." Before Mrs. Thompson could respond, the 2 officers rushed out, running toward their squad car. Within seconds, they were gone, chasing after the man who had stolen Lily. The house fell into silence, except for Lily's uneven breathing. Mrs. Thompson wrapped her arms around her, trying to calm her. "It's okay, sweetheart. They'll catch him." Lily didn't look convinced. Mrs. Thompson glanced at the clock. 1:37 a.m. Time seemed to crawl. Every second felt like an hour. Then, a noise. A soft tap, tap, tap against the window. Mrs. Thompson froze. Her blood ran cold. Lily whimpered, "It's him." Mrs. Thompson's heart pounded. The police had just left. How could he be back already? Slowly, she turned toward the window. Her breath caught in her throat. The porch light flickered. A shadow moved outside. Mrs. Thompson's hands tightened into fists. She had never been the type to scare easily. But this was different. Lily was gripping her arm so tightly it hurt. Her tiny fingers shook. Then, another noise. Not from the window this time. From the back door. A chill ran down Mrs. Thompson's spine. Someone was trying to get in. The front window. The back door. Were there two of them? She grabbed her phone with shaky hands and dialed 911 again. Ring, ring, ring. No answer. Mrs. Thompson's stomach dropped. The call wasn't going through. Lily gasped. He cut the power. Mrs. Thompson's breath hitched. If the phone lines were down, that meant he wasn't just trying to scare them. He was coming inside. She had to think fast. How could she protect Lily until the police returned? Then, the doorknob slowly started to turn. Someone was trying to open it. Mrs. Thompson pulled Lily close and whispered, "Hide." Now, Mrs. Thompson's heart pounded as she shoved Lily toward the hallway closet. "Go inside. Don't make a sound," she whispered urgently. Lily hesitated, her eyes wide with fear. "But what about you?" Mrs. Thompson forced a shaky smile. "I'll be right here. Now go." Lily nodded quickly and disappeared into the closet, pulling the door shut just as the doorknob turned again. Mrs. Thompson grabbed the nearest thing she could find, a heavy vase from the coffee table. Her hands were trembling. Was it locked? She couldn't remember if she had locked the back door. Then, click. Her stomach dropped. The door swung open. A gust of cold air rushed in. The room seemed darker than before. Someone was standing there. Mrs. Thompson's breath hitched. She gripped the vase tighter, her knuckles white. She couldn't see his face, but she knew. It was him. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the man stepped inside. Mrs. Thompson held her breath. She had to be smart. If he saw Lily, if he found her hiding place, it would be over. The man took another step forward, then another. His breathing was slow, steady, and deliberate. Mrs. Thompson had to act fast. Crash. She threw the vase with all her strength. It smashed against the wall beside him, shattering into 1,000 pieces. The man flinched, startled. Mrs. Thompson didn't wait. She grabbed the fireplace poker and swung it. Thud. It hit his arm. He cursed, stumbling backward. But he didn't fall. Oh no. The man straightened, his dark eyes locking onto her. Now, he was angry. Mrs. Thompson's hands shook. She backed up slowly, toward the hallway where Lily was hiding. The man took a step forward, then another. And then, reedy and blue like his flashy through the window. The sound of screeching tires. The police were back. The man's eyes darted toward the window, then back to Mrs. Thompson. For a second, she thought he might attack anyway. But then, he turned and ran, straight out the back door. Mrs. Thompson gasped for air, her legs nearly giving out beneath her. Bang, bang, bang. Someone pounded on the front door. Police. Open up. She rushed to unlock it, her hands still shaking. Officer Martinez and Officer Davis burst inside, guns drawn. Where is he? Mrs. Thompson pointed. He ran out the back. The officers took off in pursuit, disappearing into the night. Mrs. Thompson exhaled sharply and rushed to the closet. She yanked the door open. Lily was curled up inside, sobbing. Mrs. Thompson knelt down and wrapped her arms around her. It's okay, sweetheart. You're safe. But deep inside, she knew this wasn't over. Because the man had escaped. and something told her he would be back. Mrs. Thompson held Lily close, feeling the little girl's tiny body trembling in her arms. The danger wasn't over yet. Outside, the night was alive with chaos. Sirens wailed, police radios crackled, and the sound of heavy boots echoed through the dark streets. Officer Martinez and Officer Davis had gone after the man. But what if they didn't catch him? Lily clutched Mrs. Thompson's sweater tightly, her voice barely a whisper. What if he comes back? Mrs. Thompson stroked her hair. I won't let him hurt you, sweetheart. The police will catch him. But deep down, she wasn't so sure. Suddenly, Officer Davis's voice came through the police radio inside the house. Suspect is on foot, running toward the abandoned construction site on 5th Street. We're in pursuit. Mrs. Thompson stiffened. 5th Street was barely 5 minutes away. She turned to Lily. Sweetheart, I need you to stay right here. Lily's eyes widened in panic. No, don't leave me. Mrs. Thompson's heart ached, but she knew she had to do something. What if he got away? What if he took another child? Before she could respond, the radio crackled again. This time, Officer Martinez's voice. He's climbing the scaffolding. He's trying to escape onto the rooftops. Mrs. Thompson's breath caught. If he got up there, he could disappear into the city. They might never catch him. She looked at Lily, then at the police car parked outside. An idea struck her. Come on, sweetheart. We're going to help. She grabbed her coat and scooped Lily into her arms. She wasn't going to sit back and do nothing. Not this time. Meanwhile, at the construction site, the man's breath came in ragged gasps as he scrambled up the steel beams of the half-built structure. He had to escape. The cops were too close. They knew too much. He reached the top of the scaffolding and looked down. Far below, Officer Martinez and Officer Davis were closing in. Officer Martinez aimed his flashlight up at him. It's over. There's nowhere left to run. The man's hands clenched into fists. No, he wouldn't let them take him. He turned, searching for another way down. Then, a sound. A car screeched to a stop at the edge of the site. He glanced down and froze. It was her. The old woman, the one who had taken the girl. She had followed him. And she wasn't alone. She had brought Lily. For the first time, fear flickered across his face. You shouldn't have come. Mrs. Thompson stood firm. And you shouldn't have taken her. Lily peeked out from behind her, her eyes full of something he hadn't seen before. Bravery. Officer Davis took a step forward. There's nowhere left to go. Come down now. The man's mind raced. He had only seconds to decide. Then, he made his move. He turned, running for the edge of the building. He could jump to the next rooftop. It was risky, but it was his only chance. He sprinted forward, every muscle in his body tensed. 5 feet, 4, 3, 2. Then, he jumped. For a second, it felt like he was flying. Then, he wasn't. Crack. His foot hit the edge of the rooftop, but he miscalculated. His body tilted forward. His arms flailed. Then, he was falling. A scream echoed through the night as he tumbled down, hitting steel beams and scaffolding. His body crashed into the ground with a sickening thud. Silence. Mrs. Thompson clutched Lily tighter. The officers rushed forward, weapons drawn. Officer Davis knelt beside the man's limp body. She checked his pulse, then looked up. He's alive, but he won't be getting up anytime soon. Mrs. Thompson exhaled. It was over. She looked down at Lily. The little girl had tears in her eyes, but this time, they weren't tears of fear. They were tears of relief. She was finally safe. The chaos slowly faded. The flashing police lights reflected in Mrs. Thompson's weary eyes as she held Lily close. It was finally over. The man, the monster who had stolen Lily, was strapped to a stretcher, groaning in pain as paramedics lifted him into an ambulance. His days of running were over. Officer Martinez walked over to Mrs. Thompson, his face softer now. "You did a brave thing tonight." Mrs. Thompson let out a shaky breath. "I just did what any mother would do." Lily looked up at her, eyes wide. "You're not my mother," she said softly. Mrs. Thompson felt her heart squeeze. She knew. The little girl had parents somewhere, a real home. But tonight, she had needed someone. And Mrs. Thompson had been there. Officer Davis knelt beside Lily. "Sweetheart, we're going to find your family, okay? You'll be safe now." Lily hesitated, then looked at Mrs. Thompson. "Can she come with me?" The officers exchanged glances. Mrs. Thompson's throat tightened. She couldn't just walk away now. Officer Martinez sighed. "Well, we do need a safe place for her until we confirm everything." He glanced at Mrs. Thompson. "Would you be willing to take care of her for a while?" A lump formed in Mrs. Thompson's throat. She had lived alone for so long. She had never expected to be needed like this. She looked at Lily's small, hopeful face, and she knew her answer. "Of course." Lily's face lit up. Mrs. Thompson hugged her tight, for the first time feeling something she hadn't in years. Family. As the ambulance drove away, and the police wrapped up their work, the night finally grew quiet. Lily was safe. Mrs. Thompson was no longer alone. And somewhere, under the same sky, a new story was beginning.